All right, so Blizzard just released the 1.1 update. The season is rolling around in a couple of days. And there's some things that we need to talk about because there's kind of a misinterpretation of what's happened and also a counterproductive outcome for what was intended. And we're going to explain that. It's a lot bigger deal than some people are letting on. So we have the class changes are largely focused on numeric increases to skill upgrades and legendary aspects that players haven't really found compelling. That's good. That's really good. We have these things that are underperforming. Let's bring them up so they're closer in line with things that are overperforming. There are also a few stat decreases. A few. It's not a few. It's not a few at all. Class stat decreases on sources which grant extreme amounts of damage, healing, or unstoppable. All right, so I get the mentality. You want to bring the other things up. We haven't brought them up to the same level as the other things. We think the other things are performing, so let's bring them down so things are more equal. That's a good mentality. I understand where that's going, but let's see the execution of it. If we come down here, we're seeing critical strike damage and vulnerable damage often viewed as hard requirement for a build success in Diablo 4. We believe this is a step towards allowing more builds to flourish and will continue to make changes in support of this goal. Critical strike damage reduced by 17%. Vulnerable damage reduced by 40%. And the thing is, this isn't the only place where those things were hit. If we go through and we look at all the other changes, these were hit over and over and over again. They got destroyed. However, that's not the biggest problem. So what we need to do to get an understanding of this is come and do some Diablo 4 Stat Econ 101. You can think of our stats as an economy, right? We have a limited amount of resources we can invest. A certain number of stat affixes on gear, a certain number of legendary affixes we can put on gear, certain number of skill points, certain number of paragon points. There is a hard cap, a certain amount that we can invest. And in economies, like our stat economy here, we have the basic thing that you probably heard about, supply and demand. If you increase supply, demand goes down. If demand goes up, the supply goes down. It's this nice little trade-off. Things work out. So let's look at how damage is calculated in Diablo 4. So we're going to simplify this a little bit. We have our base, just the talent itself, and that is multiplied by the base stat, right? Let's not represent that with B. Let's represent that with R. Okay. That is multiplied by our damage percent, which we'll represent by B. We might not have a base amount of damage percent. Like this could be 1. In fact, it is 1. But we're just going to represent it with B for now, just for simplicity's sake. And we're going to add S to that. All right, cool. S is the stats that we can invest into that. R is the stats that we can invest in our base. That's multiplied by our X percent. Okay? So we'll do C for our X percent. Plus, we'll do a capital T to differentiate it from the plus sign. The investment that we can put in our X percent. All right, cool. Then we have that times our vulnerable, which we'll represent by D, plus the investment that we can put into vulnerable, which will be U. And then in addition to that, we have crit, which will be E. This isn't mathematical E. This is just E as a random variable plus V. All right, cool. So we have these 5 different numbers being multiplied together. So when we're trying to optimize our damage, what we want is for this to equal X. We want this to also equal X. We want this to also equal X. We want this to also equal X, and we want this to also equal X. We want these all to be multiplied together, because what that does is that makes each of these multipliers increase our damage exponentially it makes our damage x to the 5th. Exponential's good, right? We want all these things to be as equal as we possibly can. Now, let's look at what we did with our vulnerable here. Let's say the amount of investment is roughly equal in R, S, T, and V. So all of those things are equal to 1. But we just hit vulnerable really, really hard. So our investment in the vulnerable is now equal to 1/2. These aren't the actual numbers. This is just simplify. The thing is, we still want this. Now, to get this, we need 2u to equal these. Which means from our stat economy, from our limited number of resources, we need to invest into more vulnerable stats to get this. But we have a limited amount of stats. We can only do so many affixes. We can only do so many paragons. We can only do so many talent multipliers. We can only do so many legendary affixes. Putting extra things in the multipliers makes it to where you're not putting those other stats that they want us to invest into. So it has the opposite effect. What they have done is they have made the supply go down, which has made the demand increase, not decrease, which is the opposite of the intended effect that they were going for. This is a big problem because now to get this x to the 5th number that we want, we can't invest in the other things that we would like to invest into that would make the other builds good, that would make things function better. We have to invest less in survivability. And they hit survivability really hard too. So all it really does is dilute the pool. It makes it to where we have to put more things to get the desired effect, to get this x to the 5th, to get our damage reduction where it needs to be, to get our armor where it needs to be. It's not the intended way. It's not going to solve the problem. What would actually be better, and I know it seems counterintuitive, if we, instead of doing this, if instead of doing that, here, there we go. If instead of doing that, and I know this seems counterintuitive, what would have actually fixed the problem is if we had did this. 2. Because then we would only need 1/2 u to equal everything else. Which means we would have to invest less into vulnerable to get this x to the 5th. Which would allow us to invest more in the other stats that they're trying to encourage us to invest into. It's kind of backwards from the way we typically think, but it's just how supply and demand works. If we want to decrease demand on it, we need to increase the supply.